What is interesting about populism is that they have democratic promises, and sometimes they point out to issues that other politicians are not addressing, but their solutions tend to be extremely problematic for democracy, understood not only as the separation of powers and all that, but also in day-to-day life, right? The moment in which people are able to be aggressively racist, aggressively sexist, aggressively homophobic, democracy suffers a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. De La Torre, for being here. Dr. Carlos De La Torre is the director of the UF Center for Latin American Studies. He was a fellow at the Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. His most recent books are the Routledge Handbook of Global Populism, Populism and Quick Immersion, de Velasco a Correa, Insurrecciones, Populismo y Elecciones en Ecuador, The Promise of Perils of Populism, and many others. And you can already tell that his research interests are populism, democratization and authoritarianism, racialism, and citizenship in the Americas. So specifically, you study all of this in the context of Latin America, and a bit more specifically, Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia. Oh yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andres. This is an honor. It's so great to be talking to you.
Yeah, same to you. So definitely we'll start from the very basics. So I wanted to ask you, what is populism, right? Because when I was thinking about it and I saw your profile, I started thinking about it, and I don't think I had a clear definition of what it was. And then I started talking with friends, and I don't think they had also a clear definition in their heads of what it meant specifically, right? Like we had ideas of maybe what a populist leader would be, behaviors, things that they would do, but not necessarily a framework to tell this is a populist, this is not. So what would be, in your view, populism?
That's a very good question, and it's very complicated because scholars have been researching and theorizing on populism since the 1950s. And since then, we do not have a definition that all scholars can agree on.
Okay.
And some define it as a series of ideas about politics, others define it as a political strategy, others think that it's a political style. How I understand populism is, first of all, it's a logic of constructing politics. Politics for a populist is not a conversation in which I can convince you or you can convince me using the best argument or the logic of the best argument. Okay. The confrontation for populists between friend and enemy. Differently from fascists that will kill the enemy, populists will marginalize, will stop the enemy, will not allow the enemy to have the same rights as the other, but the logic is of friend and enemy. So populists are constantly inventing and finding enemies. In Latin America, many of the populists are fighting against the oligarchy. In the United States, Trump is fighting against the deep state. They are in this country. They are fighting against, and in Europe they are fighting against global elites. So first of all, is a logic in which you construct politics as a confrontation between two sides. Second of all, a leader is constructed and construct himself or herself as the embodiment of the people. So Chavez used to say, I am not Chavez, I am a people. So the idea is that the leader is the embodiment of the people. But of course, the people of populism is not everybody that lives in a particular nation state, but only a sector of the population. So the people of the National Rally or the National Front in France are French citizens and not immigrants of Muslim descent. So the people of populism is always a sector of the population. Or the people of Chavez were different from the oligarchy, right? So it was your position in the class structure, but also your politics. If you were against Chavez, you were not part of the people. That's the second thing. And for populism, politics is always extraordinary. For populist politics is not just voting, not the normal boring politics in which you write petitions, in which you follow the procedures of established democracy. Are these moments in which you are looking to refound the nation, to change the foundations of the nation, to make America great again, to bring back the dream of Bolivar to Venezuela. So those three aspects, right? It's a logic of friend and enemy, the leadership as an embodiment not of all the people, but of a sector of the population, and these performances of politics of the extraordinary. I hope I did not confuse you.
No, not at all, not at all. So you have also mentioned the people, right? Is the idea for we're discussing the first idea, right? The idea is for this leader to give the power back to this group of people that I imagine have been marginalized for some period of time, right? That's why kind of the populists are sometimes like charismatic and like they touch maybe emotionally to certain part of people, right? Because people like felt they were hurt. Would that be accurate, right? Is that part of the idea of being a populist?
The idea is that populists always promise to give back power to the people, power that has been concentrated in elites. So it has a democratic promise, right? So it's a promise of returning power to the people. But then the problem is, and of course, as you are saying, populism always mixes reasons and emotions. I mean, so that's when people like a populist leader, they are in love with the populist leader. Mm-hmm. And when they hate the populist leader, they hate the populist leader. And populism tends to create a cleavage in society. So in Venezuela, people are Chavista, or were Chavista or anti-Chavista. In this country, you are either a supporter of Trump or you are against Trump.
So, is there a difference between when a populist is trying to get a power and when a populist gets the power and is in charge of the judicial or legislature or something, or the executive? So what is there a difference between the interaction between the politician and the people when one is running, like when one hasn't achieved power and when one has?
That's a very good point. You have to make an analytical distinction between populists trying to reach power. That's where their promises are much more democratizing, right? They are against elites. They want to give power back to the people. They point to issues that other politicians are not looking at. So, for instance, Chavez was talking against neoliberalism, was talking about the reduction of democracy just to voting. So they are looking at real problems that other politicians are not. And that's the democratic promise that they have. However, when they get to power, two things could happen. The populists, because when populists get to power, they have to fight against the establishment. They have to fight against elites who are controlling power. So they could be defeated. And there are many ways in which populists are defeated. One is by coup d'etat. That's the history of Latin America, perhaps except Venezuela. But the rest of Latin America, from the 30s to the 70s, there was a populist in power, and then there was an attempt of a coup d'etat or a coup d'etat against the populist in power. So one way of getting rid of the populists has been a coup d'etat, which is extremely anti-democratic. The other is that the populists can not win the confrontation with the establishment, with elites. That's the case of Trump in his first term in this country, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. Even after organizing insurrections that failed, there was no military intervention, and they were temporarily defeated. The third option is that populists win in their confrontation with the establishment. And that's what Chavez did. He destroyed the traditional political parties. He created a new constitution, and the new constitution created a new system of power of the state. Instead of having the three powers of the state that you have in the United States, you have five in Venezuela. So one difference between populists trying to get to power, when populists get to office and win their battles or their confrontations with their enemies, and then when they are able of creating a regime. So Chavez was able to create a regime because he created a new constitution, new electoral laws, So he was able to stay in power for a long time. He wanted to stay in power forever, but he died. And
Right. So maybe we can get a little bit deeper into that because that's very interesting, right? Populists, almost by definition, like almost always tend to want to restructure things, right? Because as you're saying, there has been some mismanagement of the people that has come before, and there has been these people that have been left out or forgotten. So therefore, to speak to these people directly, there has to be some sort of restructuring of the institutions or society as a whole. Or so what does that restructuring look like when one gets to power?
well, it depends on the context, right?
Okay.
If the populist is able to get elected in the context of the crisis, not just of political parties, because political parties are in crisis everywhere.
Okay.
But Chavez, Morales, and Correa got to power when there was a crisis of political parties, when people did not believe in the legislature, did not believe in the legitimacy of the judiciary. And so there was all of this crisis of the state. So if populists are able to get to power in those conditions, they can change
Those
the rules of the game.
institutions specifically.
If they get to power in conditions such as the United States or Brazil, in which people were not trusting political parties, but the other institutions of democracy were working, they have much more constraints.
Oh, interesting. Okay, maybe they can restructure the inner workings of the party, kind of like what Trump is trying to do, right? Like, kind of shift the Republican Party to like his idea of the Republican Party, maybe.
Yeah. He took over the Republican Party. The Republican Party nowadays is Trump's party, but I mean, but he never wanted to change the Constitution of the United States,
Right.
and but Trump did change many things. Before Trump, there was all of this political, cultural agreement that you cannot use certain words to talk about LGBTQ communities or women or non-whites. I mean, he changed the words that people use. So nowadays people can use racist, homophobic, or machista language much more openly. So even when they don't change institutions, they can affect and change what I call democratic conviviality, the democratic day-to-day.
Okay, yeah. And that's very interesting. I haven't thought of that because, so definitely, if it were the case in a hypothetical that a populist leader would take over a U.S. in the context where, or like any country, in the context where people distrust institutions, then the target of revolution, like restructuring, is institutions, right? So maybe in a sense, it's the politicians always trying to see what is in the minds of the people that needs to be changed, right? And they go ahead and change it, right? Like they speak to that. I wanted to talk on the psychology specifically. Do you think it's because they really believe it in majority? Like, do they really say, oh, the oligarchy, we gotta get rid of that, that's terrible? Or it's a way for them, because they know that people mistrust the oligarchy, then I'm gonna say this message to get to power and then for me to stay in power. Because that's a difference, right? So what do you think happens? Of course, there's situations, but like in a majority, maybe, what is the psychology of the populace?
Well, I think that populists are opportunistic, like most politicians are. So what is their goal? I mean, politicians are opportunistic. If you are not opportunistic, you don't enter into politics. But populists are political animals. So what they want to do is to get to power and to stay in power. So their ideology, they don't have a strong ideological commitments. When Chavez was elected, for instance, he believed in participatory and protagonist democracy. Later on, he believed in socialism of the 21st century. Whatever, right? Same with Trump. Trump was not against gay marriage, or he was not too preoccupied about abortion.
He was not that Christian before, maybe.
Not at all. So then when he knew that there was a demand for that type of rhetoric. So for me, populists are very pragmatic, opportunistic. But of course, you can also have populists that are true believers, that they believe in into what they are doing. And to tell you the truth, I don't know. Perhaps a difference between a fascist and a populist, but not all fascists were dogmatically, ideologically. But let's say of Hitler. Hitler had a series of ideas, right? Especially his hatred of the Jews. So because the Jews were this vermin that needs to be eradicated from society, he make that fantasy a reality by putting them into ghettos and then into concentration camps where they were filthy and full of disease. So he's very ideologically committed, and until the end, he just wanted to destroy the Jews. But other fascists like Mussolini were much more pragmatic, and I think that populists are extremely pragmatic. I mean, of course, you can say that there are some constants, right? Chavez was an anti-imperialist, and he was always an anti-imperialist. But what does it mean to be an anti-imperialist where you're selling all of your oil production to empire, as he was selling all of his oil to the United States?
So I wanted to discuss also, you were mentioning the pragmatism of it, right? Of if you want to go to power, then people tend to think what is there to gain, or what is the narrative, what is there to say so that people support me, right? What is how does that affect even the behavior of the populace? Like, for example, you could say, if you want to speak to the lower class side of the country, maybe you would dress a certain way, you would speak a certain way. What is that relationship? And maybe if you could give examples of how that affects the behavior of the populist leaders.
That's a very good question. I mean, there is a Canadian author, Pierre Ostigui, and for him, populism is the flaunting of the law. That's his definition of populism. And another guy says that populism is bad manners. But what I mean by that is that populists want to destroy the proper ways of behaving in a culture or high-class way in politics in general. So the language that they use. Chavez was swearing all the time. I mean, if you listen to Chavez, he's swearing, he's insulting people, especially he was insulting George W. Bush all the time. Then he also has this style of talking and telling narratives, right? All of these stories that he was telling. And he was also singing all the time because Chavez had a 6-hour TV show every week. So he was singing, he was telling stories, he was insulting, he was telling people about his policies there. So there is a whole way of performance of populism that aims to break away from the proper ways of doing politics. Trump is a very good example of that. I mean, Trump doesn't follow the behavior of a U.S. politician.
Right. Like in debates, even like name calling and
name
stuff like
calling, insulting people, talking about the sexual organs of his rivals in the previous election, then shouting "lock her up" to Hillary.
Right.
I mean, all of and another thing that is fascinating about populists is that not all of them, but many of them, create these spectacles. I mean, these shows. I mean, Chavez was perhaps the best, but then you also have Trump, that for his followers is a fantastic show.
He's very entertaining to watch, right? Like you could definitely understand why people that like think that the politics does not speak to them. When you see somebody like messing around and then making a show out of it, it's like, oh, this is actually entertaining now, so I'm gonna pay attention. So it could be a positive and a negative, right? But it's just interesting.
Yeah, I mean, but we always have to go behind the performance.
Right,
but
for sure. You understand that it's a pragmatism behind it, right?
Yeah, because when you perform something, you always have an element of trying to. There's always a strategic element behind that.
For sure.
And we perform different roles in different moments in our lives.
Right, and that's the super uncomfortable, or like, I don't know the right word. Like, it's just sad that politics is definitely, it's almost by definition you have to speak to somebody. Like, you're always thinking about how others are gonna perceive you, right? So you're not necessarily, you tend to do what you believe or how you behave normally. You tend to think normally is how will people perceive me, and if I act this way, the other people are gonna like me more, and then gonna get forward or whatever.
But that only happens when politics is personalized. When we
Okay.
look much more at the person of the politician, as instead of looking at his or her ideological program or program of government. Because many people argue that until not too long ago, people voted for parties that have ideologies. So if you were conservative, you voted for the Conservative Party. If you were socialist, you voted for the Social Democratic Party. Or if you were a communist, you voted for, I'm thinking about Europe or Chile, you voted for that party. But in Latin America, our politics have always been very personalistic. So we have always been voting more for politicians as a persona than for
Right, not necessarily
ideologies.
the ideology. Yeah, maybe we can get into that. Like, why do you think is that? I honestly have no other reason than that's just like the culture, right? Or what, do you have ideas?
Because in Latin, perhaps it's because okay, my hypothesis is the following. When people were for the first time incorporated into politics in Latin America, they were incorporated in populist movements which were based on a particular politician. So, for instance, in Ecuador, the first incorporation of people that were excluded was with José María Velasco Ibarra
Okay, and what year would this be?
in the 1930s, 40s.
Okay.
Before
Okay.
that, first of all, you had exclusion. I mean, first of all, you had electoral fraud. Second of all, it was, even though men and women could vote, it was difficult for them to vote because of registration problems. But the moment in which Velasco Ibarra arrives in Ecuador, what he wants to do is he wants to make a reality the promise that the only way in which you can get to power is by winning a clean election. So he travels around the country giving speeches. To those speeches go people that will be able to vote and people that cannot vote, because in Ecuador at that time still you were excluded if you were illiterate. If you don't know how to read and write, you could not vote. But he took away politics from the cafes and the places where the elite gathered to the streets, to common people. So the first incorporation of common people to politics, and we can argue about the case of Perón. I mean, when Perón came to power, Argentinians were able to vote, but there was electoral fraud. But so with Perón and around Peronism is how people got incorporated into politics, or in Peru with APRA. So my feeling is that because people who were excluded by elites from politics, they were incorporated with populist rhetorics against the oligarchy, with populist performances, and this whole idea of taking over spaces from which you were excluded. Because it's very interesting, for instance, when in Argentina, workers could not go to downtown Buenos Aires without a jacket. And so the followers of Perón were called the descamisados, the shirtless, because they did not have a jacket on. So the idea is that those without a shirt were taking over spaces from which they were excluded.
So, okay, so, and you would say it tends to be during the early 20th century when politics stopped being like an elite only relationship and became more of a thing for everybody.
Yes, and I think that especially is after the Second World War.
Okay.
Because after the war, election is the only legitimate way to get to power.
Okay. Okay. Right.
And for a
'Cause,
time being
after the Second World War, people tend to disagree less with getting into power through violence.
But not really,
Maybe.
because in Latin America we had all of the military interventions.
Right. Right.
So I mean, on the one hand, you say that the only way to get legitimate to power is by winning elections, but then the military was often called by politicians when politicians couldn't resolve their problems, or there was a leftist in power like Allende in Chile in 1973. Or Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, in the United States, and the United Fruit Company organized a coup d'etat to get rid of him. So on the one hand, you have this idea that election is the only way to get elected, and populists are part of that democratic promise. But on the other hand, military coups were were tolerated and sponsored not only by elites, but by the United States. But that changed after the last wave of democratization. Nowadays, it's very difficult to give a coup d'etat and get away with it.
Second wave would be, you're
The
saying,
third wave, after the
Second
collapse
World
of communism.
Okay, in 80s,
Yeah,
90s.
it's when the United States decides that they are not going to be sponsoring military coups in Latin America. Of course, some people will say that they got rid of Zelaya in Honduras with a coup d'etat because Zelaya was put, who was not really a populist, but somehow of a leftist. He was put in an airplane on his pajamas and sent away of Honduras, of Tegucigalpa. But nowadays, coups are more military interventions are more difficult.
Okay. I wanted to also discuss. You've mentioned Trump. Which is associated with the Republican Party, associated with the right-leaning side of politics. If you can divide politics by like a left-right type scale, you've mentioned Chavez, which he called himself a socialist. Tends to be associated with like the left-leaning side of politics. What is the relationship with populism and that scale? Like, does it tend to move one way towards the other? And also, after this question, like, is it necessarily a bad thing? Of course, it's very subjective, but like, if you say, "Oh, a populist is rising to power," should you fear necessarily, or should you say, "Okay, but what are his ideas?" kind of a thing. Do you understand?
Yes. Let me answer the first question. The people, I mean, the concept of the people is very complicated. I mean, it's not that the people are out there. The people is a construct, a socio-political construct. So the right-wing populists tend to construct the people using ethnic, religious, and cultural categories. So the people of Trump is racialized, is also it also has a religious component. It's not only white; it's white and Christian. It's white Christian it's white and Christian. In Europe, the right-wing populists construct the people against the immigrant order, and especially the Muslim immigrant order. So that's how the right tends to construct the people. In Latin America nowadays, leaders like Bolsonaro or Milei are using the idea of the family to differentiate the people from those who are against the people. So if they believe in the sacrosanct nuclear heterosexual family, so feminist gender ideology, same-sex marriage is an attempt against the family. That's how the right constructs the people.
Okay.
The left tends to focus on socioeconomic distinctions. So you have the very, very rich, the oligarchy, and then you have the very, very poor, the people. So depending on how you define the people, you have right-wing or left-wing populism. And now, is populism, we have to make a distinction between when populists are trying to get to power, because there we have to listen to them, because they are talking about issues that other politicians are not paying attention to.
Right.
So there are problems in democracy. Of course, there are problems in democracy. The United States has, the industrialization of the United States because of globalization has made many people suffer, right? It's very difficult now for Americans to have middle-class jobs if they are factory workers because there's no factory jobs any longer, or very few. So they are talking about real issues. The problem is their solutions. Their solutions tend to be anti-democratic, exclusionary, and especially the solutions of right-wing populists are very scary.
Okay.
Because they want law and order, they want to limit the ethnic and diversity of a population, they want to limit the religious diversity of a population by imposing a particular conception of what is the right religion. So in some places, the Muslim becomes the other, in India, in Europe, in the United States. But in Israel, it's the Muslim Arab order and the secular elite. So the populist solutions are, especially from the right, are extremely complicated, historically.
Right. And it's also, I imagine, difficult to talk because the right and the left are like very ambiguous figures, would you say? Like, it's not really easy necessarily to define all right-leaning people do this, all left-leaning people do this. Like there's some tendencies.
Yes, but I think that it's a good distinction because the right believes in the market,
Okay.
and the more extreme right, who are the libertarians, believe that the best way is a market that is totally self-regulated. And the left believes
Right.
that the government and the state have to intervene in the market to ameliorate economic inequalities. That's one division of right and left. And the other has to do with religion, tradition, and what has always existed. So the right believes that the family, believes that you have men and women, that you either have this sexual makeup or another, that marriage is between a man and a woman, that the family is supposed to be that way. And the left tends to understand that there are many ways in which you can fulfill your desires, your sexual desires, different types of families, and are much more tolerant to different ways of.
Yeah, and maybe that could be a way of saying the left tends to be more open, right? Like more open to new ideas, right? Like whereas the right is like the conservative, which at least in my mind, conservative means like respect for traditions, like respect for how things have been going on, because things have been how things have been going on has been good, right?
Yes and no sometimes, because sometimes some of these right wing populists want to create something very, very new.
Okay, okay, right.
Yeah, but for the
Maybe
most.
like Milei would be a good
Yeah,
case.
Millet is a very strange case.
Maybe we can talk about that because the next thing that I wanted to discuss is like the specific styles and history of Latin American politicians. So maybe we can start with Milei. Like Milei, because definitely has been very in the news lately. So how do you see him? Like what is his message? What is he trying to speak to? Who's he trying to speak to?
Millet, the enemies of Millet are the left,
Right.
especially the Peronist left. And he argues that Argentina has been trapped by the left, who has been using the state and not allowing people to do business as individuals. Then his second enemy that is linked to the left are this bloated state. I don't know if you saw if
Yeah,
you saw
the
him
video ripping out
dripping out different
ministries.
ministries.
Right.
Then he also wants to get rid of all of the rights for women, like abortion, LGBTQ rights. In Argentina, the state has a quota for non-gender conformist people to work in different offices of the government and the state. So Milei is a reaction against all of these manifestations of the left. And why did he win? I don't know. I'm still trying to make sense of that. I guess it's because Argentina has had a very long and prolonged economic crisis.
Okay. Right, for sure, right.
With a hyperinflation that
Right.
has been destroying people. And the Peronist Party and then the traditional right of Macri were not able to solve that. And so there comes this guy who says we're going to dollarize the economy. That we're going to get rid of all of these ministries. And they go with that.
Right, and there's definitely, as you said, it's is this person that it's finding like real issues that maybe people were not satisfied from before, like the economic crisis in Argentina. Like there's the people in the news always say about like inflation in Argentina has been in like the whatever number super high, right? And people seem to be really discontent with that. People really seem to be affected by the economic crisis, and there comes this person that says, "I think I have the answer," or he doesn't say "I think." I think he sounds. Yeah. He definitely seems very confident into his answer, right? It's like this political structure, this way of approaching government would be beneficial to you, because what I'm pretty much like going 180 into how things have been in the past few decades. Would that be accurate?
Yes, it's accurate, and you know what is even more worrisome? Well, because Milei is a wild card, but that the traditional right, by the traditional right, I mean Macri and his party, Cambiemos, I think that's, or Juntos por el Cambio, I don't remember
Yeah.
which one is the name of the party, but the traditional right party, they joined the government with this guy.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I guess you can have two answers. First one is they are opportunistic and they want to be in power. Second of all, perhaps they want to control Milei so he's not totally insane. But
Okay.
that's something that elites have been doing historically. We have to always keep in mind that Mussolini and Hitler did not go to power with a coup d'etat
Like they came.
or by winning elections. They were put in power there by elites.
Oh, okay.
King
yeah.
Emmanuel
Yeah.
invited Mussolini to form a government,
Okay.
and the conservative or the leaders of the conservative party in Germany invited Hitler
Okay.
to form a government.
Yeah, I always so Hitler never won the elections.
No.
Or like.
They got like 30% of the vote, the Nazi party.
Okay.
But they created an ambience of confrontation
Okay.
and of violence everywhere. So the traditional elites were afraid of that and said, let's put this guy in charge and then we can control him. After 2 months, the traditional right lost all of its power and Hitler was able to do what he did.
And you're saying that might be an indication of what could go wrong in Milei's case.
I don't know. I don't know if he will be able to finish his term in power because he doesn't have a majority in Congress. He has a minority in Congress.
Right.
He doesn't have a political party. He has been around, I mean, giving opinions about the economy, whatever, but he's not a politician. And he insulted everybody.
Right.
But then it's so funny. I mean, he insulted the Pope in
Oh,
so
I
many
haven't-
ways.
I haven't heard of that. No idea.
Oh, that he's a socialist, that it's a
Okay.
communist Pope. And then he went to Vatican and the Pope and Milei were hugging each other and laughing.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that. But yeah, because I definitely can see it because he seems to be very anti-left, right? As you're saying, like anti-communist, anti-socialist, very much on the other side of like let's have the government be as least involved into the inner dealings of the people as possible, right?
Right.
And you mentioned, yeah, he's not a politician; he's an economist, right?
Yeah.
He's been studying, so I think that's why he feels like his theory would be good for the people because of his economical background, maybe. But just to switch, that we're talking about economist, we can switch to Correa. Right, because
Okay.
was he an economist, right? Or
Yes,
he was a
Raf-
professor of...
Rafael Correa, who was president of Ecuador from 2007 to 2017, he's an economist who has a PhD from the University of Illinois.
Okay, economist, right? So yeah, tell me, because definitely this is the topic that you would certainly be more knowledgeable. And yeah, I wanted to explore like how has been... Like maybe discuss a bit of Correa's history, like who's Correa, what happened to him, and how has been even your relationship, like seeing it over all the years, and being Ecuadorian yourself, like your relationship with Ecuador and all that,
Sure.
and the government.
So Correa comes from a middle-class family. His father was one of the first people that brought 2 kilos of cocaine from Ecuador to the United States. He was imprisoned for a few years. At that time, the penalties were not very harsh. So Correa grew up with the stigma of his father being a mulo, being somebody that
Like
was
drug-related.
a drug-related person. And Correa's mother had to, she had to work and to do things that for a middle-class family were complicated. So that's where he started. And then he went, and I think that's what changed him. Then he was a Boy Scout.
Okay.
That's the thing that he loved. And he was also very Catholic. After he finished his college degree, he went to a small community in the highlands to do pastoral service, to do missionary service. And then he got a scholarship to study to be an economist. He went to Belgium, to the Catholic University of Louvain. Then he came back to Ecuador and got a scholarship from the university where he was working to do a PhD in the United States. Correa was never a member of the left, differently from most people of my generation, and well, he's younger than I am. He never read Marx in the way in which we read it. For us, reading Marx and understanding Marxism was fundamental. But he was a leftist because of this left-wing Catholic thing of the church, right? So he was part of liberation theology, part of that. He got to power in a moment in which Ecuador had an incredible political crisis. 3 governments were not able to stay in power. We had massive demonstrations against neoliberalism. Ecuador had lost its national currency, the sucre, and the national currency in Ecuador is the US dollar. Ecuador had accepted a military base of the United States there. So Correa comes with a message. We have to get rid of all of these traditional politicians that have been using neoliberal policies, and we have to do something new. We're going to have a constituency assembly, and we're going to
Right. The new restructuring that we've been talking about.
Yeah, he sort of the Chavez model, but he never talked about the Chavez model. So he was able to destroy traditional political parties. He was able to get rid of neoliberalism. His foreign policy was anti-imperialist, and when he ruled, we had very high prices of oil, so there was money to spend. So during the first years of his administration, there was redistribution of income and poverty went down, same as with Chavez in Venezuela when the prices of oil were high. And then what is the problem with Correa? Because Correa controlled all of the institutions of government, and he was in war against the media. There was very little accountability for his government, so there was a lot of corruption. Incredible levels of corruption that nobody could say anything because newspapers had more lawyers than journalists there because Correa was suing them all the time. So corruption was a big problem. Second of all, he was very authoritarian, not only with the oligarchy or the right, but also with social movements. He entered into deep conflicts with the indigenous movement, and especially with the historical leaders of the indigenous movement, and with most organized sectors of society, and he created parallel movements from the top down, like Chavez. So if there was a student organization, a student union that was created from the bottom up, he created one from the top down.
And what does that mean? Like having access for those institutions to like the real politics, like the real government?
Giving them money.
arm?
So for instance, if the teachers union is going to make fast, is going to go into strikes or to do whatever. You create an alternative teachers union that is going to support the government, and you give them the money to do that, and you give them resources, and the other are repressed. So perhaps many teachers will abandon the original union and go to the one that was created from the top down. So the legacy of Correa was an authoritarian government, a very corrupt government, the destruction of political parties, and the media also suffered a lot.
Right, and that's something that we really haven't discussed too much, which I've heard you mention that is one of the key characteristics of populism, the attack on the media, right? Like, and the means of communication of how people found about news or whatever. So why is that? Like, why that focus for the
Because they want to impose their version of the truth as the only truth. So in the case of Chavez and Correa, they wanted to impose their truth by not renewing licenses to TV channels of the opposition, by raising the price of paper so newspapers cannot publish in subsidized paper, by making the life of journalists very complicated. In the United States, it's a bit different because in the United States, when Trump came to power, nowadays we only have niches of communication. So if you're a right winger, you will
Listen
watch
to the right-wing media.
and if you are a liberal, you will do that. So to an extent, Trump didn't needed to do that because people have already done that. But before Trump, I think that the populists in government wanted to control who has the power to communicate.
Okay, so maybe we can talk a bit more about Correa. So what were his key decisions in power, and then how he stopped being in power?
His key decisions in power were, first of all, get rid of traditional political parties. And then he created his own movement that was not called a political party that became hegemonic. Second of all, to get rid of neoliberalism and to put the state in charge of the economy. And the state was the main was the main agent that was negotiated all of the money that was coming from oil. So
Right, so more centralization of the
very
economy.
centralization of the economy, strengthening of the state apparatus, even and then controlling the legal system, to use the legal system to silence critics, being critics in the media, students, critics in universities. Those were the things that he did. It's very strange what Correa did, because he changed the constitution that was drafted when he was in power.
No, he changed.
He changed the
So
constitution.
he changed it twice.
No,
Is a way of saying it?
Well,
Maybe?
when he came to power,
Okay.
he called for a constituency assembly,
Okay.
and they drafted a new constitution. Later on, when he wanted to be re-elected forever, following Chavez, he changed the constitution.
Again.
Again. He changed
but
it-
not through a referendum. Is that what you're trying to say? Not through a call of not through voting, basically.
I don't think that it was through voting. To tell you the truth, I don't remember how they allowed for his permanent re-election. I think it was through Congress.
Okay.
But then he said that for the time being, he was not going to be re-elected. So he stepped aside and he put his two vice presidents in the ticket. One of the guy who was put as the presidential candidate, Lenin Moreno, he was bound to a wheelchair. So I think that Correa thought that somebody who's in a wheelchair is not going to have the guts and the balls to get rid of him. But what Moreno did was betray Correa. There was all of these scandals of corruption, and what Moreno did, okay, let's investigate that. They investigated that, and now Correa cannot go back to Ecuador because he will go to jail for abuses of power and for corruption.
Right. As I understand, he's in Belgium still, because he had a Belgian wife.
He has a Belgian wife, so he went to Belgium. He's living there, and now he goes to Mexico a lot.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And
to Venezuela. Now he's an advisor of Maduro on how to bring back the economy in Venezuela.
Okay. Interesting. So basically, and maybe just out of curiosity, how has Moreno's administration evolved, and what is in place now?
That's a very good question. After Correa, Moreno was in power for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
He had to face a deep economic crisis and COVID. And he was extremely inept with COVID, so it was a bad administration. Then later on, they elected a right-wing banker to be in power, and he was there for 3 years. When there was all of this questioning in Congress was trying to get rid of him, of Guillermo Lasso, he called for anticipated elections. So the new president of Ecuador, Noboa, is going to be in power only for 2 years, because in the Ecuadorian constitution, the president can get rid of Congress, but will have to resign, and then there are elections to get a new Congress and to get
a new president. Oh, interesting.
So Noboa is now in power. When Correa was in power, he did certain things that sounded like a good idea, but they had terrible consequences. By kicking out the United States base from Manta, the Americans took away the radar that they had there to intercept drug trafficking and human trafficking. So Ecuador became a hub, first of all, to traffic human beings to the United States, and later on drugs. Also, Correa said that you don't need a visa to go to Ecuador, which is a good idea. But many traffickers of human beings were using Ecuador to bring people from Asia or from wherever. So they go from Ecuador and then they will go to Central America, etc. And then the third thing is that he entered into an agreement with a gang, the Latin Kings, which is a gang that was created in the United States, but there is a chapter or whatever in Ecuador.
Okay. The name sounds cool, though.
The name is very cool. And the idea was if these guys became reintegrated to normal society, to civil society, they will have to give up all of their delinquent activities.
Right.
So those things Correa did. Then what happened in Colombia is that with the peace agreement between the government and the guerrillas, the FARC, and the FARC used to control all the drug trafficking. All of the cocaine going to Mexico was controlled by the FARC. The moment in which the FARC disappeared, you have all of these groups struggling to control the drug trafficking. So these groups are fighting in Colombia to control the drug trafficking. The drug cartels from Mexico, where you have a plurality of drug cartels, at least 3 big cartels, wanted to be the ones that control the traffic from the Colombian frontier to the Ecuadorian ports. So Ecuador became a very violent place, and a very violent place where different drug lords were fighting to control the traffic of cocaine. So what the government of Noboa did, and sorry that this is going forever, what the government
it's very interesting.
the government of Noboa did was to crack down on drug traffickers, saying that Ecuador is in a war with drug traffickers that are terrorists. So
terrorists being like out of the country, maybe?
Terrorists meaning that they want to destroy the power of the state. So with a terrorist, you do not negotiate. You put them in jail or you kill them. So the military is in the streets in Ecuador, but the problem there is that human rights get abused. So nowadays, if you are a young person, it's like in El Salvador with Bukele. If you are a young person with tattoos, the military can stop you. And if you have a tattoo that you put there by stupidity or by whatever, and you have a wolf, because there is a gang called Los Lobos, and another called Tigretones, or you have a tiger, you go to jail. And not only that, when the military are acting, trying to impose law and order, they always do these horrible machista things. For instance, there are videos of young people in their early 20s that are told to scratch away their tattoos with a knife. And there is another one in which they gave lipstick to a kid and told him, a kid, 20-something, to put lipstick in his lips. And then everybody was making fun of him. This military were making fun of him, like, oh, you look so cute. You look like a cute girl. These ways of humiliating using machista tropes. So what is happening in Ecuador is a tragedy. Because when the drug lords invade the country, there is nothing that you can do about it. I mean, in Mexico, the cartels are there. They will never leave. And in Ecuador is the same. The only solution is to legalize drugs. But how can you legalize drugs? How can you tell the American president that they should legalize drugs?
The American president, because probably making legalization in America would definitely impact all of the chain bits of Latin America, like Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, all of that.
Yeah, because, it's a great business. I mean, I think that a gram of coke, you can get it in Ecuador for $10. And here, last time I checked, which was a while back, it was $100. So.
Right, I don't keep a track of the numbers. We can go to the other countries maybe. We've talked about Chavez. Maybe we can leave it for another time. How about Maduro? How do you see Maduro.
Maduro is not a populist. I mean, Maduro got to power because Chavez named him his successor.
Right.
I was lucky enough to be in Venezuela, in Caracas, the day in which he was named a successor.
Oh, really?
And you know, this was like a feast of the left. All of these leftists were very happy. Maduro's credentials were that he was a union leader, a bus driver union, and that he was the Minister of Foreign Relations of Chavez, and that the Cubans like him.
Right.
But he doesn't have Chavez charisma. That's something that you cannot inherit. And Maduro, because Chavez believed in elections. I mean, of course, he will do everything possible to win. But the moment in which Maduro lost the legislative elections to the opposition, and then he created a constituency assembly to get rid of the power of the opposition, Venezuela stopped being a democracy. Now it is a dictatorship. And what they are doing with the opposition now, it's a dictatorship. It's so sad. And Maduro also inherited an economic crisis, and he's very inept. So one of the biggest tragedies, I mean, one tragedy of Latin America is when drug dealers start to control a nation. Another is what happened in Venezuela. All of the exodus of Venezuelans, and especially, I mean, it's not only because yes, the middle class was able, or the upper middle class, to come to the United States, or to go to Spain, or to go to Europe. When you see those poor people walking from Venezuela through Colombia to Ecuador to Lima and to Chile, it's so sad.
Yeah, and I have friends that did that from my high school and went to other, like, Peru's, Chile's, and of course I'm here, right? But moving on, how about Evo Morales? Because Evo is one of, like, also very popular, like, presidents when discussed, like, being populist, right? And Evo Morales is, like, the Bolivian president for a while back, right? Well, like
2006, I think he was elected, and he was in power for 13 years. I don't remember when he was kicked out of power because there was a feeling that he has done electoral fraud. Morales is the most interesting case.
Okay.
Because Morales is indigenous.
Right.
He says that when he was growing up, he remembers seeing buses going through his little community, and people were throwing peels of oranges, and he was getting the peels and eating the peels of oranges. And his dream was, one day I wish I will be able to be in a bus.
Riding a bus.
Right. Not only he was a llama herder, and he was a union leader of the coca growers of Bolivia. And he had little formal schooling, but he was able to get elected to the presidency, also in a context of a deep economic and political crisis. In Bolivia, the United States was forcing Bolivian governments and the military to manually eradicate coca leaves. And so the coca growers union was very strong, and Morales comes from that. So when he got to power, I mean, he wanted to empower indigenous people, and he wanted to change the character of Bolivia from being a mestizo nation to be a plurinational nation in which indigenous people were important. The problem is that Morales was a populist and authoritarian. So when indigenous people did not accept his policies, they said they are not real Indians. They are not indigenous enough. They are manipulated by foreign NGOs.
Yeah, and I've heard you say that he also used the pragmatism that we're talking about, right? Like he, as you said, was born in this indigenous background, but then as he grew up, he distanced himself from that. And then when he started getting into politics and all that, he started embracing more his his indigenous background, right? It's like,
yeah, that's correct, but that's how many indigenous people behave in Latin America.
Okay.
Because it's very difficult to be indigenous 100% all of your life, because there is racism.
Right.
So I know of many indigenous people that, at least for a time being, they try to be mestizos.
Okay.
Because in Latin America, race is much more open than in the United States. So if you're indigenous and you change your clothing style, if you speak proper Spanish, you could pass for mestizo, but of course, there is always the color of your skin, the shape of your nose, the shape of your face, that also makes you fall into the indigenous category. So,
Right, right. It's very
but
clearly to see.
yeah.
So yeah, how was Morales' government? Like, what his politics, his key decisions, and
He
what
was
happened to Morales?
authoritarian. He was authoritarian. He had a war against the media, but especially around racism. He
Okay.
created this anti-racist legislation. So they accuse newspapers of being racist, and I don't know to what extent they were racist or not, but it was a weapon that they used. He was the most fiscal conservative of the three leaders. Morales is very funny. He say, "I am an Aymara." Well, he's Quichua and Aymara, but anyways, he said,
Just
"I
like
am."
a denomination
It's
of
a denomination of indigenous people,
Okay.
and we always save just in case things go wrong.
Okay.
So that was the mantra of his government. Because Chavez and Correa spent it all,
Right.
but Morales was saving.
Okay.
Morales was
More
saving.
cautious into what to spend, right?
Yes.
Maybe not accepting as many programs and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And another thing that he did was to revalue indigeneity. Yeah, but nowadays, he was kicked out of power because he was accused of committing electoral fraud. And then there was a transitory government that was extremely right-wing, authoritarian, and anti-indigenous. Then there were elections, and Morales' party won the elections with his former minister of the economy. And now the president of Bolivia and Morales are fighting with each other to control the party.
And he's trying to go back to being a
Morales
president.
wants to be back to
Okay.
I guess it's very nice to be a president. So he wants to go
He
back.
wants to go back, right? So how about Brazil? Like, how has Brazil's politics evolved over the last couple of decades?
Well, in Brazil, they had all of these policies that were somehow started by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was a social democrat, and then Lula and the Silva and the Workers' Party, the PT, continued those policies.
Which Lula was kind of like associated with being buddies with the Chavez, the Correas,
Yes,
Evo,
but
maybe.
he was a very different type of left.
Okay.
He believed in
Okay.
democracy. He created a strong party. Of course, at some moments he was personalistic, but he was part of the Workers' Party. And they created a series of policies that were long-lasting. For instance, affirmative action in education. Brazilian universities, state universities, were mostly white. And so then the idea was, how can we open up the universities for non-white students? So they look at class and race to allow for people who are poor and who are non-white to be able to attend those universities. And they had a series of programs for the poor that were very successful. But then Brazil entered into a deep economic recession with Lula's successor, Dilma. And there were demonstrations against Dilma. And most of these demonstrations were against the PT, and there was corruption there. So Bolsonaro got to power on an anti-corruption ticket, on an anti-left ticket, on an anti-gender ideology ticket, on an anti-gay thing. I mean, he was extremely brutal in his attacks to women and to gay people. And he was a terrible administrator of the COVID epidemic. And then he followed Trump's example of organizing an insurrection when he lost the election. And he failed because the military did not give a military coup. But different from the United States, the Brazilian legal system banned him from run to power for 8 years. And now they are accusing him of trying to organize a coup d'etat when he was in power. So they took away his passport. He had to testify today. I don't know what happened because I have been working all day long.
Oh, today. Oh,
Today,
interesting.
yeah.
Okay.
So in Brazil, despite of all of the intentions of Bolsonaro of destroying democracy, democracy survived. It doesn't mean that Bolsonarismo as a movement disappeared. continue to be strong. But Bolsonaro, as a character, as a person, is in deep trouble.
Okay. Maybe a couple of minutes on Chavez, just as a wrap up.
Chavez,
What can you say about him? Yeah.
a fantastic performer. I mean, if you want to have there is the Hugo Chavez show in PBS. I think it was in PBS that they put that. I mean, it's a show about the Aló Presidentes. Chavez, for many, many years, he had this television show where we know at the time in which he started, but they never know when it will end.
Right, okay.
It can go for 4 hours, 6 hours, non-stop. He didn't go to the bathroom. He would just drink water and coffee, one coffee after another. So he was a fantastic performer. He was very interesting. I mean, what he did, which was interesting, but it didn't work at the end, was to create these experiments of participatory democracy at the local level.
Okay.
So people in the neighborhoods were given access to resources to take care of their neighborhoods. That made Chavez to be very, very popular for the time being. But he relied on high prices of oil, and he used oil to do all kinds of crazy things, like giving subsidized oil to Cuba, and Cuba in exchange sent doctors, nurses, and security apparatus. The security apparatus that they have in Venezuela now was created by the Cubans.
Security,
Therefore,
you mean like the
surveillance,
right, okay.
the surveillance, all of these, the state security apparatus. So Chavez got rid of a democracy that was in crisis, created a new regime that evolved towards authoritarianism with Maduro. And he mismanaged the economy and the production of oil. So at the end, it was a disastrous experiment, because the end result was the end of democracy, the deepest economic crisis that Venezuelans have had, and the biggest exodus of Venezuelans all over the world. But still, I still I don't know, and you know this much more than I do. Still, I'm sure that in Venezuela you have people who still love.
I was gonna ask you about that, because definitely you've mentioned that Chavez came to power democratically, right, through voting. So why, right? Why a person that ended up, as you said, destroying a country? Why did people keep voting for him?
Because at that moment the economy was doing very, very well. When Chavez got to power, Venezuela was in a deep economic crisis, so he didn't want to do anything about the economy. His first policies were to change the constitution, to have a constituency assembly. And later on, when the prices of oil went to heaven, that's when he started to believe and to dream about socialism of the 21st century. But he has given lots of things to poor people. First of all,
and really quickly for context, the oil talk is because Venezuela relied heavily on the exportation of oil, right? Like Venezuela has like a super gigantic reserve of oil, and that's basically their main exporter. So like their economy was heavily relied on oil, right?
And Chavez claimed that he wanted to get out of the reliance on oil, but the dependency of Venezuela on oil increased. And later on, now with Maduro, is on illegal mining. So Venezuela is much more extractivist than it used to be. So Chavez had the support because of, he was against the rich. He was supposedly for the poor, symbolically, discursively, and there was money to distribute even to the poorest of the poor. And then he was lucky to die when he died.
Which is a weird thing to say, but why do you say that?
Because after that, the economy went into shambles, and he didn't have to deal with an economic downturn.
He didn't have to deal with it.
Yeah.
Interesting, yeah.
And people will only remember him as the moment in which Venezuela was this very rich country. I mean, he even offered, he was subsidizing gasoline, to Cuba. He was giving very cheap gasoline to small islands in the Caribbean. He was challenging the power of the United States. He created a new an anti-neoliberal trade agreement with Ecuador and Bolivia and other smaller countries. So, and he was regarded by many people in the third world as an idol.
Right, right. Yeah, that's definitely something worth noting that in Venezuela, many people found him to be like this even god-like figure, right? Like you see like his portrait in the streets, his eyes in the streets, and people still saying, oh, we would have been much, much better if Chavez has not died and stayed in power. And
Perhaps, but perhaps he would have had to deal
the
with an
same
economic
thing, right?
crisis.
So, to finish, we've talked about a lot of politics. You've mentioned to me before the podcast that you're a sociologist, so pretty much you study society and like human relationship. That probably has imparted a lot of lessons to you. So I wanted to ask you, what are the lessons that you give back to people?
Oh, okay. That's a complicated, when I teach, what I try to teach students, and that's what I love my course on populism, is that there's not just a single definition, that your definition and your theory has normative consequences, so that things are not black or white, that there are all of these nuances, and that you have to really go into the nuances of things. But so that's part of what I do in terms of my teaching. I tend to, and not always, but I like to collaborate with the students and other colleagues in my research. And when you study populism, it's like a curse from God. I started to study populism for my PhD dissertation. And then when I was trying to get out of that, Chavez emerged, Correa emerged, so I studied them. And then when Chavez died, Trump emerged, so I had to study Trump. And nowadays that, Trump might come back. But also we have all of these right-wing radical populists in Latin America, like Milei, like Bolsonaro, like Katz in Chile. So it's a topic that continues to reappear. And what is interesting about populism is that they have democratic promises. And sometimes they point out to issues that other politicians are not addressing, but their solutions tend to be extremely problematic for democracy, understood not only as the separation of powers and all that, but also in day-to-day life, right? The moment in which people are able to be aggressively racist, aggressively sexist, aggressively homophobic, democracy suffers a lot. In the public sphere, based on civility, the respect of the other to have an opinion that is different from yours, that starts to go out. And then with populism, you have polarization. And you as a Venezuelan and I as an Ecuadorian know that polarization is horrible. And now we're living polarization in the United States. In this country, like in yours or in mine, you cannot have normal family dinners, I guess, because there is always an uncle that it's or totally pro-Chavez or totally against Chavez. So, and political conversations appear and people get crazy.
Like people get animosity, like, and I think what you're pointing out is like the polarization of like seeing this other person as like an enemy, right?
Yeah.
There's like something bad, right? Like inherently. So yeah, moving on. You've mentioned the lesson. So what are you've done this for a while, as you mentioned. What are you grateful for in your life?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. Well, I grew up in Ecuador in a upper middle class family, and therefore I was able to study in the United States. So I am grateful to the possibility of, and I was also able to live in Spain as a teenager. So I was always grateful to the possibility of moving out and seeing your own country from the distance without totally abandoning your national roots. Then I'm also very lucky that I chose the profession that I like. I love to do research. I am such a nerd. I just finished a book comparing populism and fascism, and I didn't know much about. Knew some, but I was reading like a maniac about fascism, and I was having a fantastic time. I enjoy teaching, and now that that I direct a Center for Latin American Studies, I feel so grateful because, first of all, it's an interdisciplinary center. We have faculty from the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities. We have students that come from all over Latin America and the United States. And we have a great community and great conversations.
But yeah, thank you for having this one.
Thanks so much. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
He took away politics from the cafes and the places where the elite gather to the streets, to common people. So my feeling is that because people who were excluded by elites from politics, they were incorporated with populist rhetorics against the oligarchy, with populist performances, and this whole idea of taking over spaces from which you were excluded.